everybody, and welcome. I'm Rita McGrath, and welcome to LinkedIn Live. I'm with Columbia Business School. You probably knew that. And I'm delighted to be introducing to you Atif Rafiq, who is a corporate innovation leader, but for our purposes today, the author of this great book, Decision Sprint, which is all about how you can reduce uncertainty in a effective and repeatable fashion. The book is fascinating. He's a really wise person on the subject of information and innovation. So welcome, Atif. Atif.
Rita, yeah, thanks, Rita. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Oh, it's really a delight. So for those who may not be familiar with your work, maybe give us just a high-level overview of your journey, because you've sort of done Silicon Valley and corporate, and now, as I understand it, you're back to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I'm round tripping. So I've had a couple metamorphoses in my career, but yeah, I really made my bread coming up through the tech companies in Silicon Valley, and up through 2013, I was a general manager at Amazon, leading a business unit, and thought I'd be, in the Valley working on the next big thing, forever. And in 2013, the world began to change. Mark Andreessen coined the phrase "software is eating the world," and traditional companies, Fortune 500 companies, began to see technology as potentially very disruptive to their future, their customer experience, their business model. And I had an opportunity to become the first chief digital officer in the history of the Fortune 500, a role I took on at McDonald's. And that sort of led to a 10-year run in the C-suite of large companies, helping them trying to get the elephants to dance and increase the velocity of which they kind of go about their strategy and their innovation. And so that's a lot of learnings of how to do that and distill that into a system, or why I wrote the book. And what I work on now, just touching on something you mentioned, is actually bring that to life through another startup which provides software that helps with that whole workflow.
Oh, that is great. And I'd love to come back to that, because I think that's a real missing piece. So much of innovation, as you know, depends on acts of heroism and individual people. And, when the cast of characters changes, the whole thing falls apart. But before we get there, because I do want to get into that a little bit, let's just talk about the whole kind of concept that you have developed through Decision Sprint. And I love the way that you talk about upstream versus downstream, and incorporate this idea of thinking fast and slow as part of a process.
Well, Rita, I've found the hardest part of turning a promising idea into action is actually how we deal with the unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
And unknowns are very common for any bright idea or new problem that we're trying to solve, as part of a team or on behalf of our companies, because, ideas are great, but they stay on the shelf unless we can get our head around, the unknowns. And I found that companies typically have one of two reactions: either they're a little bit cavalier about the unknowns, and that's not a good thing, or they water down their ideas very quickly because they, kind of just focus on the known commodities, and the ideal kind of loses its promise and ambition. So I wrote a book about the hardest part of innovation that I've found, which is how you make unknowns actionable. And so what I write about is how you build and run explorations, do that and how you do that in a very concrete way to feed the process of drawing conclusions, coming up with recommendations, getting alignment in the organization, and then unlocking decision making. And that entire body of work has a name. I call it upstream work, for obvious reasons, because once you've decided yes or no, you move on to execution, which is downstream. But we all know that teams spend weeks and months trying to go from the raw objective or idea to the decision point. That's what I call upstream work.
Yeah, and I love the way that you've got a graph in the book, which I don't want to break off to go find it, but sort of upstream, and then you've got downstream doing the work, and then you've got these decision points in the middle. And I think that's so important, that we don't structure enough the work that comes before the execution. What I find with companies is a couple of things. Either they're terrified of the risk of starting a new business because they haven't realized that there are very practical and easy ways to de-risk them, or they want to rush too quickly into let's do something, let's put on a show, and they haven't really thought through, oh, what's going to be necessary to demonstrate this thing is real. Or the other thing that happens a lot is they plan these things out as though they were an existing business, with all the knowns, and you can't do that when you have so many unknowns.
Those are some of the very common reactions, and it's a problem whether you're on one extreme or the other. So let's say you're a very proactive, like innovation hungry tech company. Often your first instinct is to start prototyping, and I hear this from the tech giants and teams there. That sometimes is not ideal either, because you can run into fits and starts where you prototype and you came up with some great screens and mock-ups, but you didn't poke enough holes at some of the more strategic questions. And then when the product teams are trying to say, hey, give us a green light and to move on to execution, the organization is not convinced, it's not confident enough. And so rushing ahead to just building is okay, because you can learn by building, but it's not enough. On the other hand, if you say, wow, well, this is really scary, the list of questions is a lot more than the list of answers. The thing you need to realize is that that's normal. That's actually goes part and parcel with any bright new ideas. It's how we make those questions actionable before we rush to judgment or draw conclusions. It's where we should put our energy. So I decided to provide a method to do just that.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the way you've also broken out the concept of exploration, right? And then alignment, and then decision making. I mean, and the sequence, I think, really matters. So could you give us a window into what an exploration might look like?
An exploration starts with sourcing input, and input in the form of questions. And it might be something as simple as, here's the problem statement, here's the objective. Let's have the working teams independently suggest key questions we need to get our head around, and give them 2 or 3 days to make these suggestions. At the end of these 3 days, you have probably a great question list organized by subject matter, and you kind of reduce the blind spots, number one, which I think is important before you move forward to deep diving on some of these questions. But on top of that, you've actually achieved a very important, kind of human behavioral thing, which is you've suspended judgment. And so people who are, let's say, skeptical or practical, and you need those profiles in solving problems, but they haven't brought down the idea through their pragmatism or their skepticism. You've neutralized it in the form of a question, because you're not drawing conclusions yet. So Rita, one of the main things I'm trying to promote here is the idea of creating space for questioning in a neutral way, because that's helpful. What is not helpful is kind of, skepticism linked to drawing judgment before you've even had the chance to actually explore these questions.
That's so important. And one of the great stories you tell in the book is about McDonald's. And I thought it was so interesting the way you framed it, because you said, well, okay, how do you sell stuff at McDonald's? Well, you can come in and order it at the counter. You can do the drive-through. And in either case, you can take it with you in a bag, or you can, well, I guess at the drive-through, you wouldn't be eating it in the store, but you could take it on a tray and eat it in the store. And the question you were posing was, well, what's another way that McDonald's could create a channel? And I would love to be a fly on the wall in that conversation. What kinds of reactions did you get met with?
Well, if you're an idea person, your brain's on fire, you're inventing, 3 or 4 new customer experiences, and you can see it, and you want to, you ask someone in my position in the C-suite, oh, please give me 3 restaurants which I can hack and just kind of like test these things out. So that's great, and we can definitely do that, is give you an incubation environment. But at the same time, that's not a license to say, well, no, there are some hard questions here, and so I expect you to be a lot smarter about what these questions are and how we should think about them in a month. So you get the prototyping environment, right? But you also need to not shy away from the hard questions. But as I mentioned, the other extreme would be, well, there are hard questions, so let's just like not really do anything. But that's not helpful, right? Because if you want the upside, you've got to get your head around. You've got to tackle some of the harder things.
Oh, absolutely.
as you mentioned, Rita, sometimes they're not as difficult as you think, and the human creativity helps you think through them in a better way.
Absolutely. And I find constraints are helpful because they channel where you're going to put your most critical energy. So we do have a question from the audience. I've been an avid reader of literature related to sprints and decision-making processes. I'm genuinely curious about the particular nuances that has set Decision Sprint apart from the other existing works. Could you shed some light on the key differentiation or innovation perspectives that make your book a must-read for individuals seeking effective decision-making strategies? Well, I'll start and then I'll let you come in. I think one of the things I really, really appreciated about the book as I was going through it, and Decision Sprint, here we are, is the focus on a mechanism, rather than, and they talk about this a lot at Amazon, right? Which is, don't rely on a person, don't rely on a particular leader, don't rely on, some genius coming out of the woodwork and getting it right. If you seriously want to create billion-dollar growth opportunities, and that's not the way to do it. You want mechanisms. And so I think one of the things I appreciated about the book was it's such a strong emphasis on that. So maybe I'll let you answer the question then.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, usually sprint is used in a couple contexts, in the more on the creative stage of things, design sprints, which is very unconstrained, Rita, which is like, oh, what does good look like? And then, you start talking about, the ideal sort of customer journey. And that's great. You definitely want to start with that. But you need to start building in the constraints, and that actually should not make you stuck. That should be something where you put you do the fact finding, you go through a reasoning process, you try and develop answers, or kind of come up with some good perspective on some of those harder things to kind of tighten up and make the idea better and sharpen the idea. So typically in the design thinking approach, sometimes you miss that input as well, because that input comes from across the organization. And often you find in the design sprint, it's, 2 or 3 functions of a company, engineering or design or product management. But what about legal, compliance, regulatory, marketing, operations? I mean, when you miss that input, that's why your prototype sort of falls a bit short. So I'm trying to offer a way that I think is more inclusive, because when you start with the natural language, questions, answers, by the way, all that pairs very well with Gen AI. It is a much more natural way to collect input, so you don't have blind spots.
Yeah, I think that's critical. But I also think that there's a bunch of things that are subtle here, but I think really important. So the concept in a lot of the agile world, is, oh, we've got these teams that have all the stuff that they need and they work in sprints and stuff like that. And I think that really works very well for many kinds of problems. But the stuff you're pointing at are, really big, move the needle kinds of ideas for really big companies. And you need to have something that can scale if you're going to try to do that, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and on the agile's kind of sprint development standpoint, it's more like, okay, well, let's develop a plan for 6 months, because we know that what we want to do here in the next 4 weeks, and then we'll have new information and we'll go from there. And that sort of iterative process of development, I think, is fantastic. But that is definitely much more, as you said, Rita, that needs sort of an umbrella of like, where do we need to head? What is our strategic direction? What are the key forks in the road? How do we think about those forks in the road? You will unlock a lot of execution downstream in those downstream sprints of building stuff if you have the higher level upstream forks in the road clarified. And the momentum you get in an organization or a team comes from paying just as much upstream attention as downstream attention. But sometimes we're not mindful of that, and we're like, everyone's super busy, we did a lot this year, but did we move the needle? I would ask teams to look further upstream on how that process is, how they go about it.
Yeah, well, and this gets to something I bang on about a lot, but with mixed results, which is people define what good looks like before you set off on this journey. Like, where are you trying to go? And a lot of times that's completely unclear. I was working with a client last year, and brand new project, and my partner and I said, well, have you defined what success would be? Oh yeah, we're absolutely clear on it. 3 months later, I wish I'd read Decision Sprint actually before having that conversation, because I would have tried to put them in a much more structured kind of conversation. Um, so in the book, you talk about setting teams up for success. You talk about creating the conditions for this to work. And I think that's really important, because what I find is people don't mean badly, but they've got a set of inherited practices which worked, in the past, or which are working for the existing business, but they're just completely anathema to the new businesses.
Well, yeah, I think the very first thing you can do to help a team do their best work, in these kinds of innovation areas or new ideas or new problem solving, new territory, is creating the space for that ambiguity. So what I mean by that, Rita, is sometimes the higher up you go in the company, you think your job is to actually know the answer right away. And that's actually not the job. It's actually to um, help us understand how we should think about it by coming up with the right questions, calibrating how we're thinking about these questions, and then formulating like, okay, this the conclusion we draw based on that. It's like trying to help solve a puzzle. So, one of the best ways to kind of create new upskill, let's say, because let's say the organization or the culture or the people are already good at getting things done, execution. A workflow will help them know that actually what the company needs from me is not that right now. It needs me to create the space, which are the conditions you're referring to, Rita. You create the conditions through the workflow of like, oh, the step we're at is to turn the ambiguity not into confusion, but into questions that we can explore. And that is a constructive way to handle the ambiguity. And then you kind of hold a hand through that process of exploration, which I talk more about. And then knowing the answer comes and saying, having a strong opinion and utilizing your judgment comes a bit later. So the workflow, I think, is how you begin to upstill and regulate kind of some of maybe the person has too much strength on execution, for example.
Right. Well, and what I love, okay, so I'm going to dive into the book because I'm a book nerd, So on page 48, you talk about 13 workflows, and I'll just lift some off quickly because I think they're just super useful for our leaders, because what I like is the whole structure of it. So initiating exploration, sourcing matters, sourcing questions, calibrating the exploration, sharing the canvas, answering questions, calibrating answers, drawing conclusions, preparing for alignment, conducting an alignment, identifying decisions, preparing content, and conducting decision meetings. And what I like so much about these is, first of all, you spelled out what each of those look like, but that can become then a process in a company. I mean, you could say, okay, we're on, workflow number 6. The next thing we're going to do is that. And that's something that can be learned and mastered. And it doesn't require some magician laying on hands. I just thought that was really strong in the book.
Well, I hope it's easy to plug into how the company works. So typically, you say, okay, well, we'll form a team and there'll be an executive sort of check-in every 6 weeks, right? So those two things, that's just depends on your company and how it works. Great. And with Decision Sprint, now you can layer in exactly what you said, Rita, which is like, okay, to be ready here in 6 weeks for this executive review, what are we going to use that for? Well, we're going to, we're going to come in with a set of FAQs. We're going to have canvas the key questions, collected our thoughts on that, and then we're going to showcase this in that particular interaction. Okay, well, the next executive review is where now it's game time, right? We're going to say this is how we're thinking about what recommendations we're making. So you can begin to layer in, some of these 13 workflows against these milestones where you kind of get things decided in your company, and that's how you kind of plug it in. And it's better, I think, than just sort of like scurrying at the last moment for an executive review. We make that interaction very purposeful. And then the sponsors of the initiative, they understand the big picture. This is where we're at. This is where we're going. This is when we will be ready to make yes or no decisions.
Yeah, and what I like about that is it puts, it creates useful constraints without limiting the ideas necessarily. So we've got another question, and then I want to ask you about personas. So, Atif, in your experience, why decisions in companies get stuck and become repetitive and old and put the company in danger? How does a company get that eureka moment in order to change the way they decide? That's an interesting question.
Well, I mean, I do believe that, having conviction is a very big part of getting companies to move quickly. So painting a picture of what good looks like is a great way to start. And so I think, however you do that, more power to you. I think getting people to see and believe in the power of an idea is always going to be the spark, and the best spark. And then just to make sure that that spark doesn't die, then you say, this is how we're going to action it. Well, we already know there's a lot of unknowns here. Here's our list. Here's how we're going to tackle it. Our next interaction with you is going to be a month out, where we've understood these unknowns, gotten to the bottom of them, and we're going to, draw some conclusions based on our exploration, our discovery. Here's where you're at. That's how you kind of keep the spark going. So if you have to kind of provide the rails for the company in order to make sure that they don't lose kind of the passion and the spark.
Right. Yeah, well, I know at Amazon they talk about guardrails rather than toll gates, which I think is a really nice way to think about it. So toward the end of the book, you talk about the different personas, and some of them are a little, well, I didn't expect, skeptics and pessimists to pop out as necessary for the process of innovation. Maybe you could share with us some of your less conventional ideas about those people.
Well, just to illustrate it, I mean, I think something that's typical in a big company is you have innovation teams, right? Like, so let's say, I'll make it up here, but like your Volvo, we did actually, start a Silicon Valley office, and now, well, that sounds great, and we hired, great people from Google, Amazon, and Waymo, other places, so very idea oriented. But one of the cultural sort of fault lines you need to manage is that if we're just innovating in a vacuum, right, then we lose critical input, because let's say in our headquarters, in our mothership, there are people who are, shipping what we're building for today's product versus like what the product looks like in 4 years. And that input, what I'm calling input, and you're referring to as constraints, Rita, is important. Now, because if you're just building a concept or a prototype and you miss these constraints, well, your prototype is less good, right? It's missing sort of critical factors that it should be solving for. And then, you shouldn't be surprised as an innovator if if your idea, you get some head nods, but people are not really that convinced. Now, that will happen unless you get that input early enough to actually integrate it into your problem solving, right? And so that's where skeptics and pragmatists are actually useful. You want to extract out their input in the neutral form upstream as early as possible in order to factor that in. Then you're ready to have your idea be more bulletproof, if that makes sense. And so rather than trying to, avoid, pragmatists and skeptics, which I understand how difficult these personalities can be, I try to provide a way to neutralize their input into something that's actually constructive. And I think that's the key to solving problems in a way that's inclusive without being bureaucratic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I really think that's smart. I also think if they're involved early enough, right, they get a little piece of ownership. They get a little piece of, yeah, they didn't ignore me till the very end, right? And they're much more likely to be persuadable that this thing needs to be supported. So we've got just a few minutes left. We're here. My guest is Atif Rafiq. He's the author of a great new book called Decision Sprint. But beyond the book, you're now on another venture, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, Ritual is an AI software company that helps bring some of these ideas to life through workflow. So Ritual is a software app designed for teams. It can work for just one or whatever initiative a particular team is working on. and it helps them do everything from craft a problem statement to run a sourcing period to come up with the right questions, and then keep the team on track to develop FAQs and eventually spit out documentation they can take to a meeting, like a narrative. And it accomplishes this through workflow, but also integrates Gen AI to do things like, okay, well, the questions that as humans we came up with is a certain list, but then the Gen AI may help us suggest other questions we might want to include in our exploration to look into. So it's a workflow plus AI solution for essentially innovating, solving problems at a team level.
I love that. So in a way, the AI becomes part of the team, right? You can use its capabilities to supplement what a team of ordinary human beings could do.
I think there's this wonderful pairing coming between knowledge worker and AI, where basically AI will help speed things up, so to speak. So I'm definitely not in the mindset of, for this kind of innovation, problem solving work, replacing humans, because I think that's not, I don't think that's the future of getting it right. I think it's basically using the Gen AI to make sure we don't have blind spots. Or, for example, I write an answer to a question, and then Gen AI tells me, hey, you're making a claim here. Do you have any data or evidence? Maybe you can include a link to the dashboard, things like that. So basically helping you kind of round out your work and make it better and raise the bar on it. That, I think, is the role of AI, sort of in the process of higher level knowledge work. I'm not talking about repeatable things that can just be purely automated. I'm talking about the work of going from strategy to action, which is a lot of what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, and I'm actually at the moment working with a data scientist, and he asked me a fascinating question the other day, which was, he said, what power would you have if you could spend $10 and get the analytical output of 1,000 McKinsey consultants with the push of a button? And I was like, whoa! I mean, that's a whole new world, right?
Well, yeah, and in fact, I'm glad you mentioned McKinsey, because what good looks like to me is any team in any company kind of feels like are working in that McKinsey BCG way, where you're asking critical questions, and like things are so well reasoned, and everything like is pretty strategically thought through, right? But we don't need McKinsey for that, or BCG. We can do that with the human capital we have. We just have to unleash it. And a lot of things you said earlier, Rita, about the system. If you have the right system, you get that intellectual capital flowing from your people.
Mm-hmm.
You have less reliance externally. I'm not saying McKinsey's going out of business. I don't believe that. But I'm talking about raising the bar and unleashing more of the intellectual capital from the great talent we already have. That's kind of the future I believe in, and how AI will help do that. And obviously, the software I'm working on is trying to enable that type of world.
Well, what I particularly like about what you just said, and where I find the consultancies sometimes are not as helpful as they could be, is they sort of take over the work for you. They do the thinking for your people rather than helping your people become enabled to do that thinking for themselves. And I think that's perhaps, with software like yours, perhaps that's where the future is going. Well, this flew by. So, okay, how do people find out more? How do they become part of your world? How do they figure out what the next thing is? Do they come for you for help? Do they buy your software? Tell me what next.
Yeah, all of the above. Like, if you check out decisionsprint.com, you'll learn more about the ideas in the book. If you visit ritual.work, you can get your hands on our software. And if you have a question for me, or I can be helpful, then you can find me on LinkedIn, and I do read my messages. And I'm definitely looking for companies or teams within companies that are progressive and want to experiment in a new way to kind of bring their innovation, their problem solving skills to the next level through software, or even just the methodology of Decision Sprint.
I think it's a terrific set of ideas. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. And people, check out the book, Decision Sprint, structured way of organizing your upstream innovation process and connecting it with your downstream process. So thanks very much. Have a great rest of the day.